book of Shoftim, and it begins with, of course, the death of Yoshua and the fact that Bnei Yisrael asked Hashem, meaning Urim v'Tumim, who shall be the first to conquer the unconquered territory. And we discussed why do you need a first, and the answer was Yehuda shall go. Now, if you remember our map, Yehuda basically has the entire southern part of Eretz Yisrael from Yerushalayim until the southern boundary. That's a very large portion. All of that is the chelik of Yehuda. And Yehuda then turns to Shimon to create an alliance or a confederation. And Shimon and Yehuda go ahead and they do their job. Once again, there's a detail here that you would only know from the book of Yoshua. You wouldn't realize it from here. But it makes perfect sense for Yehuda to conquer the territory with Shimon, because in point of fact, Shimon's own territory are separate cities that are located in the chelik of Yehuda. In fact, I have to admit that the lashon of the pasuk is a little difficult, because the language of the pasuk is that Yehuda says, or we don't know who spoke, but somebody, the Nasi of Yehuda, said to the Nasi of Shimon, help me conquer my portion, because then I will help you conquer your portion. Meaning this is a reciprocal agreement. Now, l'chora, it's not really a reciprocal agreement, because conquering the land of Yehuda will automatically conquer the territory of Shimon. But maybe not, because Shimon has specific cities. So Yehuda is basically saying, you help me conquer my territory where your cities are not located. I will help you conquer your territory where your cities are located. Again, remember the uniqueness of Shevet Shimon. Shevet Shimon was the only tribe other than Levi, which is a separate cheshbon, which did not have a complete, uninterrupted territorial portion, but rather the cities of Shimon were muvla, they were absorbed within the territory of Yehuda. Now, Levi was similarly that way, in the sense that Levi had 48 cities that were dispersed among all 12 tribes, on an average of 4 cities per tribe. But I think, just to repeat the thought, the idea that both Shimon and Levi are going to be dispersed is marumaz in Yaakov Avinu's deathbed blessing curse for Shimon and Levi. Remember that Shimon and Levi didn't really get a blessing at that point, but Yaakov cursed their anger because they wiped out Shechem in their anger. And Yaakov's final words were, Al chalkeim b'Yaakov, I will divide them among Jacob, among the children of Yaakov. Afitzeim, they will be scattered b'Yisrael. So the notion that they will be scattered is repeated twice in somewhat different words, because one is a remez to Shimon being scattered, and the other is a remez to Levi being scattered. Levi is scattered in 48 cities among all the 12 tribes. Shimon is scattered within Yehuda. And I think we learned when we learned this in Yoshua, that the reason for the scattering of Levi is not the same as the reason for the scattering of Shimon. The reason for the scattering of Levi is ultimately a positive reason. We want the spiritual influence of Leviim to permeate all of Klal Yisrael and not just be limited to a certain section. Imagine if you just had a Levite section, so like all the Torah would be in the Levite section. We want the Leviim to be all over. With Shimon, it's kind of the opposite idea, that because Shimon is volatile, Shimon is violent, Shimon is prone to losing his temper, or the tribe will lose its temper, we want to kind of diminish their power by scattering them and keeping them contained in Shevet Yehuda, which became the dominant tribe of Malchus. But be it as it may, it is very, very logical that Yehuda would collaborate with Shimon, because essentially their territories are intertwined in that way. So after that proposal is made, so we are told that they were successful, and they had a campaign in Bezek, Bezek, not to be confused with the telephone company, but indeed it's taken from here. Bezek is a word for lightning, but that was the name of the town of Bezek. And there was a major victory against the Canaani and the Perizi. Perizi are one of the 7 nations of Canaan. And they they smote 10,000 people. 10,000 people, casualties. And they captured the king of Bezek, whose name was quite logical, Adoni-Bezek, the master of Bezek. But initially it describes that he escaped, they pursued him, they grabbed him, and here we get some of the very disturbing stories that are very, very difficult to reconcile with 21st century political correctness. But again, it's difficult even for Ben Torah to try to understand. It says when they captured Adoni-Bezek, they cut off his thumbs and his big toes. In other words, the thumb of the hand and the thumb of the foot. They cut it off. They mutilated his body. And Adoni-Bezek accepted it. He said a curious thing. He said, there were 70 kings in Canaan that I had done this to. I had cut off their thumbs and cut off their toes. And they were crawling like dogs under my table, eating the scraps of whatever food we threw down to them. And now Hashem has done to me exactly what I had done to the 70 people that I had mutilated. This is called Mida, Keneged Mida. So, I mean, normally, again, we don't really have a lot of explanation here. I mean, normally, even when there's a mitzvah to kill somebody, you're not supposed to mutilate them and torture them. This is true whether it's Misa spaced in, like you're killing someone who was given warning because they're Machal Shabbos. And it's even true when you kill Amalek, or you kill the 7 nations who don't make shalom, right? There's a mitzvah to kill them. But killing them is not the same as torturing them. Because you have to understand that the purpose of killing is not vengeance, it's to eradicate evil in the world. So you eradicate the evil. There's no point in torturing people. So the notion of torture, or okay, maybe I'm not sure if torture is the right word here, but something like mutilation, which certainly is psychological torture, if nothing else, is something that's very foreign to what you would call the Jewish law of war, even as against Amalek and the 7 nations of Canaan when there's a mitzvah to kill them. Killing is not the same as torturing. Here, we do have an example where this king actually had this mutilation done. So one question is, who decided? Was there a nevuah? Was there a prophecy? Did God command that it be done by Urim Betumim or by Navi? Doesn't say. Was this something that the leaders just decided? By the way, who are the leaders? That's another question here, right? Yeshua is dead. We don't yet have the first shofet. We don't even know exactly who the leader is at this point. So we have to leave it as a bit of a mystery. I mean, the easiest answer, which is your answer to all difficult questions, is it must have been a Navi. That would answer the moral dilemma. But we still don't have any textual evidence of that. If it was a Navi, though, it's very, very clear that even Adoni-Bezek recognized that this was an extraordinary punishment because of Mida Keneged Mida, that God treats you the way you have behaved. And since he had himself engaged in this mutilation, how does the saying go? What goes around comes around, or what comes around goes around. I don't know which way you say it. But whatever it is, that's the Mida Keneged Mida, that he did it for 70 people. It happens to him again. Do you remember the story of Hillel? Not story, it's in Pirkei Avos. Hillel once saw a human skull floating on the river. A victim of a drowning. Somebody had drowned him. So Hillel said in Aramaic, because you drowned somebody, That is why you were drowned. And the person who drowned you is going to be drowned as well. So that's the idea of Mida Keneged Mida. The Chafetz Chaim would tell the story. It's an amazing thing. The Chafetz Chaim said, when he was a young man, 20 years old, he once witnessed a very, very disturbing scene. It was the middle of the winter, rotten, right? Poland, Lithuania, the winters are cold. And a widow and her orphans, a widow and her children, were evicted from their dira, from whatever they were staying, because they didn't pay rent, and the landlord was so cruel. He was very wealthy, and they didn't pay their rent. He threw them out of the street in the middle of the winter. And the Chafetz Chaim couldn't understand how could HaKadosh Baruch Hu tolerate such a rishus, such an evil. And the Chafetz Chaim said, 70 years later, this man was still very wealthy, but he became, crazy or had dementia, whatever it would be, and he just wandered out of his house in the winter, not wearing clothes, and he froze to death. And the Chafetz Chaim said, this was because of what he had done 70 years before. He threw a widow into the street in the cold winter. He died by freezing in the cold winter, even though it made no sense. He had plenty of money, he had plenty of clothing, he had a house to go into. But he was sick, he wandered into the street, he froze to death. This is the idea of Mida Keneged Mida. It sometimes takes 70 years, and sometimes longer. Do you remember, they just finished the repairs. They had a big celebration in France, but there was a major, major fire in the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Right, just this year they finished the thing, but it was like 10 years of repairs, but it was a major, major damage of one of the great, great medieval cathedrals. And it was pointed out that this fire that really damaged this priceless building, this was the very place where the Shas had 24 wagon loads of Gemaras had been burnt by order of the Catholic Church in front of Notre Dame Cathedral in the 1200s. So you're talking about how many years it took for there to be a Mida Keneged Mida. Now, why Hashem works on that timetable, we have no idea. But ultimately, there will be this Mida Keneged Mida Din V'Cheshbon. And what's striking is, Adoni-Bezek, who was hardly a righteous person, recognized immediately that God was doing to him what he had done to others. I'm sorry, Jonathan.
How are we supposed to distinct between making like a speculation that the Chafetz Chaim is making here versus what might just be spurious correlation? I mean, it's certainly ironic that that's how he perished, but...
Well, again, I mean, obviously, I can't say that we have proof, but it's certainly a reasonable hypothesis. And since we know from Chazal that Hashem is Noheg, Mida Keneged Mida, so the Chafetz Chaim felt he could put the two pieces together, because it was very, very improbable. I mean, there was no particular sensible reason why the guy should die that particular way. But the Chafetz Chaim remembered. How many people even knew that first story? Most people didn't. So most people would look at it, they would just look at it as a crazy guy got frozen in the winter. And the Chafetz Chaim remembered something from 70 years before. Yeah. Well, in some ways, I would say yes. First of all, this very case is a non-Jew treating non-Jewish people, right? So this very case is a Mida Keneged Mida involving non-Jews on both sides. Now, if you're asking me, does it apply if a Jew mistreats a non-Jew? I think the answer would be, it all depends on what the halacha would be, meaning to say, without getting into all of the halachos, if halacha permits a Jew to do something to a non-Jew, such as lending money with interest, there's not going to be a Mida Keneged Mida punishment because there's no wrong. If there's no wrong, there's nothing to be punished for. If, on the other hand, it's a type of abuse that halacha says you're not allowed to do to a non-Jew, then presumably there would be a Mida Keneged Mida. So Mida Keneged Mida obviously follows the halacha in many ways, meaning that which is permitted is not going to have that negative consequence. But what's interesting is, going further, Adoni-Bezek did not suffer that long. We're not told exactly how long, but it says after he was mutilated, after he acknowledged that this is Mida Keneged Mida, he was brought to Yerushalayim and he died there. Again, everything's ambiguous. He died there, meaning was he executed there? Or did he die from the mutilation? Don't know. But there is a little bit of a problem. They brought him to Yerushalayim. Well, we're going to read in a few verses in this parak itself, they didn't conquer Yerushalayim yet. So sometimes the confusing narrative of Sefer Shoftim is that when you're talking about a person, you complete the story even though you're not there yet historically, meaning to say, eventually they did conquer Yerushalayim. And when they conquered it, that's when he died, even though he didn't die right now because they didn't conquer Yerushalayim yet. In other words, it's kind of giving you a foreshadowing of something. The other answer, which is actually simpler, is Yerushalayim has many, many neighborhoods, components, and part of Yerushalayim had been conquered, part of it had not been conquered yet. In fact, some of it was not conquered until David HaMelech's time. So this is the part within they had conquered already, right? The HaRav area had not been conquered, but other parts were conquered. Okay, so that's the first incident that is recorded. That is the death of Adoni-Bezek after his mutilation. Then it says, Bnei Yehuda conquered Jerusalem, and they burnt down the city to get rid of all of the Canaanite influences. Now, once again, therefore, you already see, right? The pasuk right before this says Adoni-Bezek was brought to Yerushalayim and killed or died, and the next pasuk is they conquered Yerushalayim. Okay, and we also know from the book of Shmuel, as I just said, that some of the city was not conquered until David. So obviously this just means some. Now, so Yerushalayim was conquered in many, many different stages. But the other thing is, if you remember in the book of Yehoshua, the conquest of Yerushalayim is attributed to Shevet Binyamin. In the book of Shoftim, the conquest of Yerushalayim is attributed to Shevet Yehuda, and that's not counting the part that David HaMelech gets later, which is also Shevet Yehuda, but that we're not talking about. So again, remember your map here. Yehuda has all the southern territory from Yerushalayim, indeed, to the southern boundaries. Binyamin is directly north of Yehuda. Okay, Yehuda, north of Yehuda is Binyamin, north of Binyamin is Ephraim, etc. Okay, but it's Yehuda, Binyamin. But the way the boundary dipped was Binyamin is north of Yehuda, but at some point the southern boundary of Binyamin dipped a little into what would have been Yehuda's territory, then came back up and then continued. Okay, so instead of looking at two rectangles, Yehuda, Binyamin, imagine, two rectangles, but in the southern part of Binyamin, there was a dip down into the Chelek of Yehuda that then went up again. Okay? Now, that dip occurs exactly in the middle of Yerushalayim. which means part of Yerushalayim was in the Chelek of Binyamin, and part of Yerushalayim was in the Chelek of Yehuda, because Binyamin's had a little dip of its territory into Yehuda. And in fact, the Gemara in Megillah explains that the Beis HaMikdash itself was divided. No, lahavdil, I don't know if this is true anymore, in the at the Canadian border with some point in Maine, there's actually a public library that the U.S.-Canadian border runs through the middle of the library. So it's a funny thing. You take out a book in the shelf, you're in the U.S., and you go and you check out the library book. You have to go through passport control. I think they make it a little easier. It's not a whole full thing, but you gotta go through something. You go to the bathroom, you're in one country, etc. Right? So it's mamish in the middle of the library is the U.S.-Canadian border. Now with Trump's tariff wars, I'm not sure if maybe they're going to make it tougher to use that library now with all that retaliation, unless Canada becomes the 51st state or whatever it is, and Israel will be the 52nd state. Anyway, so the thing is this: lahavdil, infinite havdalos. The Beis HaMikdash was actually the same situation. The point basically was that we did have this division between Yehuda and Binyamin, and it was exactly Yerushalayim and the areas of the Temple Mount. And that's why some psukim talk about Yehuda conquering Yerushalayim, and some psukim talk about Binyamin conquering Yerushalayim. But be it as it may, neither Yehuda nor Binyamin conquered everything. The part about the Kodesh HaKodashim, the HaRav, unlike indeed waited until David HaMelech. And the reason for that is, Chazal say, was actually a mistake that Avram Avinu made. Avram Avinu, the Torah records, made a treaty with Avimelech, Melech Plishtim. And he made a treaty that there would be a non-aggression for 4 generations. Avimelech, his son, his grandson, his great-grandson. 4 generations. And this part of Yerushalayim that could not be conquered, there was still a descendant of the 4th generation of Avimelech that was still alive. And therefore we were powerless. We were not allowed to conquer that section of Yerushalayim until Avimelech's last, at least the 4th generation descendant, died. Okay, so that's not here. That's not in the book of Shoftim. That part of the conquest of Yerushalayim is not in the book of Shoftim. That's going to be in the book of Shmuel. That's going to be a conquest of David HaMelech. Okay. Now, the next part, again, I'm reading it fairly closely because there's a lot of problems in the psukim. The next part of Perek Aleph is actually a repetition of Sefer Yoshua, meaning everything we're going to read is actually in the book of Yoshua. Why it is repeated again is a little bit difficult, but it talks about Hebron. Hebron is a city in the Chelek of Yehuda, and Hebron is in Yehuda's Chelek, and it tells us that Hebron used to be called Kiryat Arba, the city of Arba. Now, why is Hebron called, or why, unlike today you have Hebron and you have a modern Jewish settlement that's called Kiryat Arba, but in the Torah, Kiryat Arba is the original name of Hebron. And we don't only know that from Yeshua and Shoftim, we know it from the Torah itself. The Torah says, when Sarah died in Hebron, Hebron is Kiryat Arba. So why is Hebron called Kiryat Arba? So Chazal give us two different explanations why Hebron is called Kiryat Arba. Explanation number one, in the Ma'aras HaMachpelah, the double cave, where the Avos are buried, we have four pairs who are buried. We have Adam and Chava, we have Avram and Sarah, we have Yitzchak and Rivka, we have Yaakov and Leah. Yosef, we know, is buried in Shechem, and Rachel is buried in Beis Lechem, Kever Rachel. So Kiryat Arba, the city of the four pairs, that's one pshat. Second pshat is that the Canaanites who lived in Hebron were the giants, and there were four giants. It mentions three of them: Sheshai, Achiman, Talmai, and their father was who's not given a name, was the fourth giant. So Kiryat Arba can mean the city of the four giants. And the third pshat is that Arba is actually a name, and it's the name of the father of these three giants. So Kiryat, so it's kind of a double thing. The city of the four giants, or the city of the man Arba that had the three children as giants, right? So Arba was actually his name. Now, when we talk about giants, right, the idea that the Canaanites were giants, or there were giants among the Canaanites, this we already know from the Meraglim, right? The Meraglim came back and said, we were like grasshoppers. They were giants. So, once again, just in terms of pshat, when you say that the Canaanites were giants, like what exactly did you encounter? Did you encounter like Godzilla? Did you encounter like, people that were 200 feet tall? Lav dafka. Even al peep pshat, a giant could be, Baron Trump. It basically means they were unusually tall in the world. So they could have been 6'5", they could have been 6'6". Giants does not necessarily mean miraculous. Now, in the case of Og Melech HaBashan, Chazal seem to talk about his dimensions in a miraculous way. Even then, the Maharal says that may be symbolical or metaphorical. But in terms of giants, you don't necessarily, because again, archaeologists point out we don't really have evidence of 20 feet tall people. Okay, Beseder. So number one, in general, absence of archaeological evidence is not considered to be that negative anyway. I mean, that's a general rule. But besides that point, there is indeed archaeological evidence of people who were unusually tall as compared to the rest of the world, 6'5", 6'6", etc. So when it says giants, it's Shaykh that it refers to that. Because again, if you're a 5'8", and you confront a large group of people that are 6'5", you feel like you're surrounded by giants and the like. Okay, so this is Kiryat Arba, and it says that it was conquered by Yehuda, Shevet Yehuda. Now, we know from the book of Yehoshua that there's a little more detail to that, and that is, not only was it conquered by Shevet Yehuda, but it was conquered under the leadership of a very specific person, and that is none other than Kalev ben Yefuneh. Kalev ben Yefuneh, the co-spy with Yehoshua years earlier in the Midbar. Kalev was 40 years old at the time of the Meraglim. He was therefore 80 years old at the time they entered Eretz Yisrael. Now, there is a bit of a shaila here, because here's the question. When did Kalev conquer Hebron? Did he conquer Hebron in the lifetime of Yehoshua? Or did he conquer Hebron after the death of Yehoshua? You see, In Sefer Yoshua, the implication was he conquered Hebron in Yoshua's lifetime. And indeed, if you recall, Kalev then tells Yoshua that Moshe Rabbeinu promised that Hebron would be given to me. And indeed, it is recorded that Kalev did not get his portion through lotteries. Kalev got his portion directly. He got the city of Hebron because of Moshe Rabbeinu's promise, which actually implies pretty clearly that the conquest of Hebron was Bimei Yehoshua. In fact, at the very beginning of the 7 years, when Kalev was 80 years old. So therefore, when the book of Shoftim says Yehuda conquered Hebron, it's understood in a past perfect tense, not that they did it now. They had already, in other words, since we're describing the kibush of Yehuda, so it says Yehuda had already conquered Hebron. In other words, it's not describing what they're doing now. They had already conquered Hebron earlier. So, Yoshua, so the book of Shoftim tells me Yehuda conquered Hebron. But we know from the book of Yoshua that it was Kalev ben Yefuneh who conquered Hebron. And that was given to him because of the promise that Moshe Rabbeinu made. Just to remind you, again, this is Chazorah. Why did Moshe Rabbeinu promise to give Kalev Hebron? Because when the Meraglim came to Hebron, as they're traveling through the land, Kalev stopped to go to Ma'aras HaMachpelah to pray in the merit of the Avos, that Hashem should protect him from the evil conspiracy of the Meraglim. And because he used Hebron as his Makam Tefillah, he was Zocheh to get Hebron. Another point of Hebron to keep in mind, however, is, again, this is Chazara, but it comes up again, that Hebron actually is a Levite city. It's one of the Levite cities in the Chelek of Yehuda. And Hebron is an Ir Miklat, city of refuge. So how could Hebron be given to Kalev if Hebron is Are Leviim, Ir Miklat? So Chazal answer that when it says Kalev was given Hebron, it is not the actual city of Hebron, but it is the surrounding villages around Hebron that were given to Kalev. Hebron itself was an Ir Leviim, and it was an Ir Miklat. Okay, so in terms of chronology, once again, there's a lot of things that if you hadn't learned Yoshua, you would be misled, because you would assume that the conquest of Hebron was what Shevet Yehuda did after the death of Yoshua, when in fact we know from Sefer Yoshua that this was done in the lifetime of Yoshua, and therefore we have to interpret they conquered Hebron as they had already conquered Hebron. See, that's called in English past perfect. It's not a simple past. It's something that's earlier than the point that you're talking about right now. In Hebrew, it's not so clear. In Lashon HaKodesh, it's sometimes difficult to know if you're dealing with a simple past or a past that had already occurred before the event that you're describing. In English, we distinguish it with the word had. So if I say he ate, that's different than saying he had eaten. He had eaten is earlier, right? Because he had come home, say he came home and ate, is a different sentence than he came home and had eaten. You see? He came home is, I'll give you an English grammar class, he came home is called a simple past, and ate is also a simple past, meaning he came home and ate. He came home and had eaten is a past before the past. It's something he did before he came home. So that's called a past perfect. So in English, it's indicated by words like had eaten instead of he ate. In Lashon HaKodesh, both are usually in a regular past tense. So that's why Mefarshim sometimes argue whether a past is a simple past or it's a past that's earlier than the event that you're describing. So based on the otherwise contradictory accounts of Yoshua and Shoftim, when was Hebron conquered, we have to assume that in Shoftim you're dealing with a past perfect, meaning Yehuda had conquered Hebron. Since we're mentioning their conquest now, so parenthetically we say they had already conquered Hebron, and we know from Yoshua that the man who conquered Hebron was indeed Kalev, and he was given Hebron, or the villages around Hebron, as a reward from Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, then it goes on and it continues with the story that we know from the book of Yoshua, and all of this is past. All of this is things that have already happened. You see? It's already happened. And it mentions another city that Kalev wanted to conquer. So it's interesting. It doesn't mention Kalev but Hebron. It only mentions Kalev about the second city. In Yoshua, it mentions Kalev both Hebron and the new city. And the second city is a city called Kiryat Sefer. Kiryat Sefer. And Kalev says, apparently this was a stronghold of Canaanites, difficult to conquer, in the Chelek of Yehuda, near Hebron, the one that will smite Kiryat Sefer and conquer it, I will give Achsah, my daughter, to him as a wife. And the person who stepped forward was a man called Othniel ben Kenaz, and he conquered, he led an army that conquered Kiryat Sefer, and as a result, he married Achsah, Kalev's daughter. Now, Othniel ben Kenaz is going to become very famous a little later on, because he is actually the first of the Shoftim. But apparently, he is not yet described as a shofet here. He was a shofet for 40 years. 40 years. But remember, because this is a past perfect, this story is not taking place now. This story took place in the lifetime of Yehoshua. Okay, be sure you understand that. We're projecting it back. Then, Othniel was not a shofet. He was a private citizen, and he was the one who was credited with the conquest of Kiryat Sefer and the marriage of Achsah. Okay, very good. But we have a problem. He is described as Kalev's younger brother. Othniel ben Kenaz is Kalev's younger brother. So the Gemara asks the obvious question, wait a second here. Who was Othniel's father? Kenaz. Othniel, the son of Kenaz. Who was Kalev's father? Kalev, the son of Yefuneh. So how could they be brothers? They have different fathers. So the Gemara explains they are half-brothers who share a mother. And that is, when Kalev's father, Yefuneh, died, so Kalev's mother married a man, Kenaz. And from the marriage to a man, Kenaz, they had a son who was Othniel. So Othniel ben Kenaz is Kalev's half-brother from the same mother, but much younger than Kalev. Kalev, at the time of this story, is 80 years old. We don't know exactly Othniel, but apparently if Othniel is getting married, he probably is a much, much younger person. So that also means Othniel married his half-brother's daughter, which is his niece. I don't know if it's called half niece or whatever it is. But halachically, that's permitted. In fact, halachically, you're allowed to marry your full niece. You can marry your brother's daughter. Okay, you are allowed to marry your brother's daughter. This is an interesting asymmetry in the halachic laws of incest, because a nephew is not allowed to marry an aunt. Right? One of the arayas is you cannot marry your father's sister or your mother's sister. A nephew cannot marry an aunt, but an uncle can marry a niece. Right? Othniel was an uncle. Right? Nothing wrong with marrying a niece. Now, a little correction here. The Welt says, and how this mistake was made is unbelievable. We just had the holiday of Purim. Now, in Megillas Esther, it mentions Esther was an orphan, and Mordechai raised her as a bas, as a daughter. So if I just read the Megillah, the relationship of Mordechai and Esther is like an adopted child. But Chazal have a drasha that the word bas also means bayit, home, that Mordechai and Esther were married, right? So you all know that Mordechai and Esther were married. Now, you'll commonly, people will always say, Esther was Mordechai's niece. Everybody says that. Esther was Mordechai's niece. But it's very, very clear that although if she would have been a niece, it would have been permitted to marry her. That's true. But in point of fact, Esther was not his niece. Esther was his cousin. Just look at the Megillah itself. The Megillah basically says that Esther's parents, or Esther's father, was Mordechai's uncle. If Esther's father was Mordechai's uncle, then Esther and Mordechai are first cousins. So the common statements that this is uncle and niece are not correct. Nevertheless, it is true that you are allowed to marry a niece, and Othniel ben Kenaz married a niece. Okay. One final point about this. I just want to bring the Mishnah in Yevamos, that when you marry your niece, there are some very interesting Yibum complications. Let's say you have two brothers, Reuven and Shimon. Okay, Reuven and Shimon. Shimon has a daughter. Reuven marries Shimon's daughter. Reuven then dies without any children. So his wife falls liyibum to her father. So what is the mitzvah of yibum when the yavama is an erva? So the first Mishnah in Maseches Yevamos makes the point that when an erva to the yavam falls liyibum, there is no yibum at all. You don't even need chalitza. But then it adds a tremendous chiddush. What if Reuven, the guy who died, had more than one wife? He had Reuven's daughter, and he had other wives. So you might think there ought to be yibum on the other wife, who's not an erva. So this is the famous halacha that the erva exempts not only herself, but the erva exempts every co-wife from yibum or chalitza. So even if there's 10 co-wives, these are called saras erva, the co-wives of an erva, and there's no yibum or chalitza for any of them. Okay? So that'll be a potential complication in these types of issues. Okay?
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.